watching the Daily Roundup by People's Dispatch, where we bring you some of the top stories from around the world. Let's take a look at the headlines. Chinese President Xi Jinping hails Russia ties while on three-day visit. IPCC scientists issue final warning on climate change. Protests continue against pension reforms in France. Brazil relaunches more doctors' healthcare program. China and Russia's presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin on Monday, March 20, met in the Russian capital Moscow on the former's three-day visit to the country. The two leaders reportedly held extensive talks regarding the bilateral relations between their countries and their areas of shared mutual interest. This was the first visit by the Chinese president to Russia since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. However, the two leaders have spoken several times on the phone and through video conference since the beginning of the conflict. Just before the start of the conflict, the two leaders had together declared that the countries have a relationship which has no limits, signifying the closeness and trust between them. They once again reaffirmed their close and expanding ties yesterday, with Xi noting that there is a historic logic for the closeness and that for both countries the relations are of high priority. He additionally called for deepening their bilateral practical cooperation further, something which Putin seconded as well, adding that it would help in promoting the establishment of a more equal and multipolar world. Notably, Xi's visit comes in the wake of the Chinese proposal for a peaceful resolution for ending the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Among the key points that China has included in its proposal are that both parties to the conflict go back to the negotiating table, mutually agree to a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, and address the ongoing humanitarian crisis and ensure the protection and well-being of civilians and prisoners of war. China has additionally urged both sides to respect international law and each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. It has also urged the international community, primarily the West, to abandon the Cold War mentality. In this regard, China has warned against countries imposing unilateral, arbitrary sanctions on any side, especially as they lack the proper legitimacy and support at the United Nations. In contrast, the West, mainly the United States, continues to take a more and more aggressive and hostile stance towards Russia, with the United States approving another fresh round of military aid to Ukraine worth $350 million, which will only contribute to fueling the conflict and violence even more. The world's foremost climate scientists from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on Monday, March 20, released the final part of their massive sixth assessment report. The scientists, through the report, have issued a final warning on the climate crisis, saying there is still time for the world to take concrete and drastic action before it is too late to reverse and avoid its worst effects and consequences. Named the Synthesis Report, it reportedly took hundreds of scientists 8 years to compile and is said to be the most comprehensive review of human knowledge on the climate crisis so far. Running into thousands of pages, the report is reportedly the last such assessment to be carried out while the world can still act on limiting global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. 1.5 degrees is the cutoff point after which the adverse effects and damage of global warming and climate change will start becoming irreversible. The report goes on to say that more than 3 billion people already live in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate breakdown. Additionally, half the global population suffers from water shortages for extended periods every year. It notes that the adverse climate changes, fluctuations, and effects are already reaching the limit of human adaptability in many parts of the world, leading to increasing displacement of people in Africa, Asia, North, Central, and South America, and the South Pacific. It warns that if the world fails to take the required action, all these changes and effects will aggravate and worsen even further. Responding to the report, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said this report is a clarion call to massively fast-track climate efforts by every country and every sector and on every time frame. He further called on richer, more developed countries to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions as close as possible to 2040, instead of waiting until the 2050 deadline. The IPCC, meanwhile, said that finance is key, adding that the transition to green and renewable sources of energy needs at least between 3 and 6 times the amounts of funding currently devoted to green investment, according to the final section of the IPCC's comprehensive sixth assessment report, known as AR6, of human knowledge of the climate. In our third story, protests and blockades continue across France, denouncing the unpopular pension reforms forcefully pushed through the French parliament by the Emmanuel Macron government. Police have used force at multiple places to break through blockades, used tear gas to disperse people, and also made arrests at several cities. Spontaneous protests erupted across the country on March 16 when French Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne invoked the emergency provision, Article 49.3 of the Constitution, in the Parliament to bypass voting and pass the controversial pension reform. On March 20, the government survived a vote of no confidence tabled by the opposition groups in the National Assembly, which fell short by 9 votes. The coordination of the trade unions and left-wing parties, including the New Ecological and Social People's Union, or NUPES, called for major mobilization on March 23, marking the 9th nationwide day of strikes and protests since January 19. The pension reform proposed by the French government on January 10 this year calls for an increase in the retirement age from 62 to 64. It also stipulates a mandatory 43 years of service before one is entitled to a full pension and benefits. Trade unions and pro-worker political parties have outright rejected the reform and called to increase wages, pensions, and reduce the retirement age to 60. On March 20, the General Confederation of Labour, or CGT, said that against public opinion, against the unions, and without a vote adopted by force, the pension reform is rejected by 95% of workers. The struggle continues. We need citizen consultation. The no confidence motion tabled by independent legislators was backed by 278 MPs, 9 votes short of the 286 votes required, including of the MPs from the NUPES coalition and reportedly by more than a dozen MPs from the Republicans, the party which supports the government. Meanwhile, the second no confidence motion filed by the far-right National Rally, or RN, received only 94 votes in favor. The left-wing party La France Insoumise has stated that the mobilization against the reform continues until Macron, Borne, and the government back down. And finally, the Brazilian government on Monday, March 20, relaunched the new version of the significant and widely popular Mais Médicos, or More Doctors program. The new program has been rechristened More Doctors for Brazil and was announced by the Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva at a ceremony in Brasilia. The program stipulates for the hiring of 15,000 new doctors and other medical professionals by the end of this year, which reports said will increase their total number in the program to 28,000. The first public notice for the program is said to be announced in March, consisting of 5,000 vacancies. The remaining 10,000 vacancies will be announced in the subsequent months, jointly by the federal government and local municipalities. Brazilian doctors will be given preference in the hiring, but foreign doctors and professionals registered with the Ministry of Health will also be allowed to apply for the selection process. The program has further offered various kinds of incentives and bonuses for doctors based on the length of time they serve in the program, among other criteria. According to reports, the original program was launched in 2013 by then Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. The program since then has been hailed as one of the most significant milestones in the history of healthcare in Brazil. The program was focused on providing basic healthcare in the rural areas and smaller towns of the country, which had historically suffered from inadequate healthcare services. It reportedly served millions of people in the rural and remote areas of the vast country and was considered by many as a major success of the government. But the subsequent government of the right-wing ex-president Jair Bolsonaro opposed the program and drastically reduced its scope and size by cutting its budget. Reports noted that due to the actions of the previous government at the end of last year, more than 4,000 family health teams had no doctors in them. The current government is set to invest 712 million Brazilian reals in the program this year, and it estimates that the program will benefit approximately 96 million Brazilians. And that's all for today's episode. For more such stories, visit our website peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.